I realized something was wrong the moment I walked into my grandson Ethan's birthday party and saw that every single chair at the table had a name on it except mine. The living room was bright with colorful balloons tied to the backs of chairs and a long table covered with blue paper plates and a dinosaur-themed cake that probably cost more than the groceries I bought for a whole week. Children were running across the carpet laughing while a playlist of cheerful songs played from a speaker in the corner. The smell of pizza and chocolate frosting filled the air, and for a moment it looked like the kind of happy afternoon any grandmother would be grateful to see. I stood near the doorway holding the wrapped gift I had brought for Ethan, a large box containing the telescope he had been talking about for months after learning about planets at school. The box was heavier than it looked and I shifted it gently in my arms while scanning the table where the adults were supposed to sit. That was when I noticed something strange. There were 8 chairs arranged neatly around the table and each one had a small folded name card sitting on the plate. I saw David's name. I saw Lauren's name. I saw the names of 2 neighbors and a couple of Lauren's friends from work. But there was no card with my name. At first I assumed I was looking in the wrong place. I stepped a little closer and read the cards again just to be sure. My eyes moved slowly from one plate to the next while the laughter of children echoed around the room. Still nothing. No Margaret. No Mom. No Grandma. Just empty space where a chair should have been. For a moment I told myself not to overthink it. Birthday parties can be chaotic and people forget things. Maybe there was another chair somewhere else. Maybe Lauren had simply not finished setting the table yet. I placed Ethan's gift carefully near the stack of presents by the wall and looked around the room again. That was when Lauren walked out of the kitchen carrying a tray of drinks. She spotted me standing near the table and gave a bright smile that looked polite from a distance but somehow felt different up close. She set the tray down and brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear while glancing toward the table. I asked quietly where I should sit, keeping my voice calm so I would not interrupt the celebration. Lauren followed my gaze and then let out a small laugh that sounded almost rehearsed. She said, "Oh Margaret, I guess we ran out of chairs," as if the situation were the most harmless mistake in the world. A couple of guests nearby chuckled awkwardly while pretending to focus on their phones. I looked back at the table once more and noticed something that made the room feel a little colder despite the summer heat outside. Every single chair was taken. No one else seemed to be standing. No one else was missing a place at the table. And that was when I saw the small plastic chair sitting alone near the corner of the room beside the children's table. It was bright blue, the kind you buy at a discount store for toddlers who are learning how to sit still during snack time. Lauren pointed toward it with the same cheerful smile and said I could sit there if I wanted. For a second the noise of the party faded and all I could hear was the quiet hum of the air conditioner above the doorway while I realized exactly what kind of joke this was supposed to be. I looked at the small blue plastic chair again and for a moment I wondered if maybe I had misunderstood something. Birthday parties can be noisy and confusing and sometimes details fall through the cracks. But the longer I stood there the more obvious it became that this was not a mistake at all. The chair was placed carefully beside the children's table where Ethan and his friends were already gathering with paper party hats and plastic cups filled with orange soda. It was not just any extra chair pulled from the garage. It was a chair meant for a toddler, barely 2 feet tall, the kind that makes a soft squeaking sound when a child shifts their weight. Lauren stood beside the table watching my reaction with a light smile that suggested she expected everyone to laugh along with the situation. A couple of guests nearby exchanged uncertain glances but no one said anything out loud. I could feel the moment stretching longer than it should, the room filled with cheerful decorations that suddenly looked less welcoming than they had just a few minutes earlier. I heard Ethan shouting happily from the other side of the room as he showed his friends the new toy truck someone had brought him. For a moment my eyes followed his voice and I reminded myself why I had come. This was his birthday, not a stage for adult arguments. I slowly walked toward the corner where the little chair waited beside the kids' table. The legs of the chair made a faint scraping sound against the wooden floor as I pulled it out slightly. A few of the children looked at me with curiosity but quickly returned their attention to the pile of balloons on the carpet. I lowered myself carefully onto the chair and felt how small it really was. My knees rose higher than they normally would in a regular seat, and the table in front of the children barely reached my waist. From across the room I could see the adult table where the other guests had already begun to sit down. Lauren was pouring drinks and laughing with two women who looked like neighbors I had seen once before. My son David stood beside the kitchen counter checking his phone as if nothing unusual had happened. For a moment I waited for him to look up and notice where I was sitting. I thought maybe he would realize something was wrong and bring another chair over without making a scene. But he did not look in my direction. He simply nodded while Lauren said something to him and then picked up a stack of plates for the cake. The music from the speaker switched to another cheerful song and the children began running circles around the living room again while the adults talked over the noise. I sat quietly among the tiny chairs and plastic cups while the party moved forward as if everything were completely normal. That was when Lauren walked past the kids' table again carrying a bowl of chips. She glanced at me briefly and said in a playful voice that everyone could hear that it was good for me to sit with the children because it kept me young. A few people laughed politely and then looked away toward their drinks. I nodded once as if the comment were harmless and folded my hands in my lap. But inside my mind a different thought had already begun to form. The kind of quiet realization that does not arrive with anger but with a slow understanding that something in a family has changed in a way that cannot be ignored anymore. I stayed in the small chair for several minutes while the birthday party continued around me as if nothing unusual had happened. Children laughed and ran through the living room chasing each other with balloons while the speaker played cheerful songs that echoed softly against the walls. The blue plastic chair creaked slightly every time I shifted my weight and the tiny table in front of me was covered with paper plates printed with cartoon dinosaurs. One of Ethan's friends asked me politely if I liked dinosaurs and I smiled and told him I thought they were fascinating creatures from a very long time ago. The boy nodded seriously as if that answer satisfied him and then he returned to building a tower with plastic cups. Across the room the adult table looked comfortable and relaxed with full-sized chairs and glasses of lemonade sitting beside bowls of snacks. Lauren moved between the kitchen and the table laughing with her friends as she passed out napkins and party hats. Every once in a while she glanced toward the children's table where I was sitting and each time she gave the same bright smile that suggested the situation was still part of some harmless joke. My son David stood near the counter opening a box of candles for the cake and speaking with a neighbor about the local baseball team. I waited again for him to notice me sitting among the children, but his attention stayed on the conversation. The moment reminded me of something I had slowly begun to notice over the past few years, small situations where my presence seemed to fade quietly into the background of their lives. It had not always been this way. When Ethan was born, Lauren had called me every week asking if I could come help with babysitting while David worked long hours at the office. I used to drive the 35 miles from my house to theirs almost every Saturday morning carrying bags of groceries and homemade soup so Lauren could rest for a few hours. I remembered rocking Ethan to sleep in the small guest room while rain tapped softly against the windows and thinking how lucky I was to be part of his life. Those memories passed through my mind now as I watched him across the room showing his friends the telescope I had brought him. He had not opened the gift yet, but he kept pointing to the large box and telling everyone it was from his grandmother. Hearing that word warmed me more than the summer air drifting through the open window. For a moment the uncomfortable chair beneath me mattered less because Ethan still saw me as someone important in his world. Then Lauren walked to the center of the room and clapped her hands to gather everyone around the table for cake. The children cheered and rushed toward the decorations while the adults followed more slowly with their drinks. I stood carefully from the tiny chair and joined the group near the cake where candles were being placed on top of the frosting. Lauren handed Ethan a party hat and adjusted it on his head before turning to the guests with a cheerful voice that carried across the room. She joked that it was time for everyone to gather around except those already sitting in the children's section because apparently I had claimed that spot for myself. A few people laughed politely again and someone said it looked like I was having more fun with the kids anyway. I nodded quietly and stepped back to give Ethan space to blow out the candles, but inside I could feel a quiet realization forming with the kind of clarity that only comes after many small moments finally connect into a single understanding. The room filled with applause as Ethan leaned forward and blew out the candles while everyone counted loudly together and the small flames disappeared one by one, leaving thin trails of smoke drifting above the cake. Children cheered and someone started clapping again while Lauren quickly picked up the cake knife and began slicing pieces for the guests. I stood slightly behind the group near the edge of the living room watching Ethan laugh with frosting already smudged lightly on the tip of his nose. The moment should have felt simple and happy, and in many ways it still did, because Ethan's excitement was genuine and bright in a way only an 8-year-old could manage. But somewhere beneath that warm scene another quiet feeling had begun settling into place inside my thoughts. It was not anger and it was not embarrassment anymore. It was something calmer and more certain, the kind of understanding that arrives slowly after years of small signals that are easy to dismiss until they begin forming a pattern. Lauren moved through the room handing out plates of cake while reminding the children not to run with forks in their hands. She gave the largest pieces to Ethan and his friends before passing smaller slices to the adults who gathered near the dining table. When she reached me, she paused briefly and then placed a plate in my hands with a polite smile that looked carefully practiced. I thanked her quietly and stepped toward the kitchen counter where there was a little more space to stand. From there I could see most of the room, including the tiny blue chair still sitting beside the children's table where I had been earlier. The chair looked almost like a symbol now, a small reminder placed in the center of a celebration that was supposed to be about family. I took a slow bite of the cake and listened to the conversations around me. A neighbor asked David about a new project at his office while another guest complimented Lauren on the decorations. Every voice blended together into the comfortable noise of a typical suburban birthday party. For a few minutes I said nothing and simply observed. I noticed how easily Lauren guided the rhythm of the gathering, deciding when the cake would be served and when the presents would be opened. I noticed how naturally David followed her lead without questioning any detail. That observation did not come with judgment, only clarity. Families change over time and roles shift in ways that are sometimes subtle. I realized that somewhere along the way my place in their lives had moved quietly to the side without any formal conversation acknowledging the change. Ethan suddenly ran toward me holding the telescope box I had brought earlier. His eyes were bright with excitement as he asked if we could open it right away because he wanted to see if he could spot the moon before sunset. I smiled and told him we would definitely try later if the sky stayed clear. His enthusiasm wrapped around the moment like a warm blanket, and for a brief second the tension in my chest softened. Ethan hugged the box and ran back to show his friends again while I watched him cross the room. That was when David finally walked over to where I stood near the counter. He held a glass of lemonade and looked slightly distracted as if he had just remembered something important. He asked if everything was going well and if I was enjoying the party. His tone was casual and friendly, but it carried the distant politeness of someone who had not fully noticed the earlier situation. I looked at him for a moment before answering. There are certain points in life when a person can either pretend nothing happened or quietly begin speaking the truth in small careful steps. Standing there in the kitchen with the noise of the party behind us, I understood that this afternoon might become one of those moments. I looked at David for a moment before answering his question, and in that short pause I realized how many years had passed since the last time he had truly studied my expression the way children do when they want to understand what their parents are thinking. The music from the living room drifted into the kitchen along with bursts of laughter and the sound of wrapping paper being torn open as Ethan and his friends began gathering around the gift table. David took a sip of lemonade and waited casually as if he expected a simple answer. I finally nodded slowly and told him the party looked wonderful and that Ethan seemed very happy. That part was completely true. Ethan's excitement filled the room like sunlight, and no small discomfort could change that. David smiled in relief and glanced toward the living room where Lauren was helping Ethan open another present. For a moment it looked like he might return to the party without noticing anything unusual, but then his eyes shifted back toward the children's table where the small blue chair still sat beside the dinosaur plates. His gaze lingered there for a second longer than before, and something in his expression changed slightly. He looked back at me and asked in a quieter voice why I had been sitting there earlier. I shrugged gently and said that it seemed to be the only seat prepared for me. David frowned with confusion and glanced again toward the living room as if trying to piece together something he had missed. He opened his mouth to say something, but at that exact moment Ethan shouted his name from across the room, asking for help opening a box that was taped too tightly. David hesitated and then gave me an apologetic look before heading back toward the group of children. I remained near the kitchen counter finishing the last bite of cake while watching the party continue. Ethan eventually managed to open the telescope box and he lifted the long silver tube carefully while his friends gathered around to look at it. Lauren stepped in quickly to remind them not to drop it, and she glanced briefly in my direction again. Her smile was still there, but it seemed thinner now, as if she had noticed the quiet conversation David and I had just shared. The afternoon sunlight had begun to angle through the windows, casting long golden shapes across the floor, and the energy of the party slowly shifted from loud excitement to the calmer rhythm that comes after cake and presents. Some guests moved toward the backyard while others began collecting their coats from the hallway. I stepped outside onto the small patio for a moment to breathe the warm air and listen to the distant hum of traffic from the road beyond the neighborhood. Ethan ran out a minute later carrying the telescope with both hands and asked if we could try it before his friends left. I knelt beside him and helped adjust the tripod while he pointed it toward the pale shape of the moon that was already visible in the early evening sky. When he looked through the lens, his face lit up with wonder and he told everyone that he could actually see the craters. Several children lined up behind him waiting for their turn, and their excitement created a small circle of laughter in the backyard. From the corner of my eye, I noticed David standing near the patio door watching us quietly. He folded his arms and looked thoughtful, as if the image of me kneeling beside Ethan with the telescope was connecting to the earlier scene inside the house. Sometimes understanding arrives not through arguments but through simple moments that reveal what truly matters. As the children continued taking turns with the telescope, I had the feeling that the quiet conversation David and I had begun in the kitchen was not finished yet, and that before the evening ended something important would finally be said. The children stayed in the backyard for nearly 20 minutes, taking turns looking through the telescope while the evening sky slowly deepened from pale blue to a softer shade that hinted at sunset. Ethan moved from friend to friend with the proud excitement of someone who felt responsible for showing everyone something magical. Each time another child looked through the telescope, he waited patiently beside them and then asked what they could see. Some of them said they could see the moon clearly while others only saw a blurry circle, but Ethan nodded seriously every time as if each answer were important. I adjusted the tripod a few inches to keep the lens steady and he watched carefully as though learning a small secret about how the instrument worked. Moments like that had always been my favorite part of being a grandparent. There was a quiet satisfaction in guiding curiosity without needing recognition from anyone else in the room. Eventually the children began drifting back inside when their parents called them for one last slice of cake before leaving. Ethan followed them reluctantly after giving the telescope one last look through the lens. I folded the tripod slowly and carried the telescope toward the patio door where David was still standing. He stepped aside to let me pass, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The living room looked slightly calmer now, with half-empty cups on the tables and balloons resting against the walls after the excitement of presents and cake. Lauren was near the kitchen sink rinsing plates while speaking quietly with one of her friends who was preparing to leave. David motioned for me to follow him a few steps into the hallway where the noise of the party softened. He looked toward the children's table again, where the small blue chair remained pushed under the edge like an unnoticed detail from earlier in the afternoon. His expression tightened slightly as if the sight of it finally carried the meaning he had overlooked before. He asked me again why I had been sitting there earlier, and this time his voice carried a seriousness that had not been present before. I answered calmly that when I arrived that was the only place set for me and I had not wanted to make a scene during Ethan's celebration. David looked genuinely puzzled for a moment and then glanced toward the kitchen where Lauren was still talking to her friend. He ran a hand slowly across the back of his neck while thinking. It was clear that he was trying to recall whether he had noticed anything unusual while the party was beginning. I told him quietly that the chair itself was not the real issue. The important part was the feeling that came with it. Sometimes small gestures reveal larger truths about how people see each other inside a family. David listened without interrupting, and his eyes moved again toward the children's table as if the tiny chair had suddenly become much louder than it had seemed before. From the living room, Ethan's voice echoed happily as he thanked one of his friends for coming to the party. The simple joy in his voice reminded me again why I had stayed calm through the entire afternoon. David finally exhaled slowly and nodded as though a piece of the situation had finally settled into place inside his mind. He said he needed to speak with Lauren after the guests left because something about the arrangement clearly did not feel right. I did not argue or press him further. Sometimes the most powerful conversations begin quietly after everyone else has gone home and the decorations are taken down. As the last guests began gathering their coats near the door, I had the sense that the evening was moving toward one of those moments where honesty would finally step into the room and change the direction of a family's story. The last of the guests began leaving as the evening light faded into the soft glow of porch lamps along the quiet street. Parents called their children toward waiting cars while balloons drifted lazily against the ceiling inside the living room. Ethan stood near the door, giving each friend a quick hug before they left and thanking them for coming to his party with the serious sincerity that children sometimes show when they want to behave like grown-ups. I watched him from the hallway while holding my coat over my arm, and the telescope box rested carefully beside the wall where he had placed it earlier. Lauren moved through the living room collecting empty cups and stacking plates while offering polite goodbyes to the remaining guests. Her voice sounded cheerful but slightly tired, the way it does after hours of hosting a celebration. David stood near the doorway speaking quietly with one of the neighbors who had helped set up the folding tables in the backyard. When the final car pulled away from the curb, the house suddenly felt quieter and larger without the constant laughter and music filling the rooms. Ethan carried the telescope back toward me and asked if we could try looking at the stars later that night after it became fully dark. I told him that would be a wonderful idea, and he grinned before running upstairs to change out of his party clothes. The sound of his footsteps echoed lightly through the hallway before fading into the second floor. For a moment, the house was still except for the gentle clink of dishes from the kitchen sink. Lauren wiped her hands with a towel and walked into the living room where David and I were standing. She looked around at the decorations and sighed softly as if mentally planning the cleanup that still needed to be done. David glanced at me once before turning toward her with a thoughtful expression that was calmer than I had expected. He asked her if they could talk for a moment before putting everything away. Lauren seemed slightly surprised but nodded and leaned against the back of one of the dining chairs. David gestured subtly toward the children's table where the small blue chair remained tucked beneath the edge exactly where it had been all afternoon. For a second Lauren followed his gaze without understanding, and then her expression shifted as she realized what he was referring to. David asked quietly why that chair had been set out for me when there were plenty of normal chairs in the house. Lauren gave a quick laugh at first as if the question were about something trivial and said it had only been meant as a playful joke to keep the seating simple for the kids. She explained that she thought it would lighten the mood of the party because everyone knew I enjoyed spending time with Ethan anyway. David did not laugh with her. He remained still and said that it had not looked like a joke when he finally noticed it and that it had not felt right to him afterward. The room grew quiet for a moment while Lauren studied his face, trying to decide whether he was truly serious. I remained near the hallway listening but not interrupting because this was a conversation that needed to happen between them. David continued speaking in a calm voice, explaining that small things inside a family can carry meaning even when they are intended as humor. He told her that respect was not measured by grand gestures but by simple choices that show someone they belong at the table with everyone else. Lauren looked down at the floor for a moment and then toward the little chair again, as if seeing it differently now that the party was over. The silence that followed was not hostile but thoughtful, like the pause people take when they realize a moment from earlier in the day might have been more important than they first believed. From upstairs Ethan called down asking if it was dark enough yet to see the stars, and the sound of his voice drifted through the quiet house like a reminder of why this conversation mattered in the first place. Lauren remained quiet for several seconds after David finished speaking, and the room seemed to hold its breath in that moment of reflection. The small blue chair beside the children's table suddenly looked very different now that the laughter of the party had faded away. Without the noise and decorations surrounding it, the chair appeared out of place in a room meant for adults gathering together. Lauren slowly walked toward the table and rested her hand on the back of one of the regular dining chairs as if she needed something steady to think. She said quietly that she had honestly not believed the situation would feel serious and that she thought everyone would simply laugh and move on. Her voice was softer now and carried none of the playful tone from earlier in the afternoon. David nodded but did not interrupt her explanation. He said he understood that the intention might not have been harmful, but that intention and impact are sometimes very different things. A family celebration should make everyone feel welcome and included, especially the people who had been part of that family long before the decorations and birthday banners were hung in the living room. Lauren glanced briefly toward me, then looked down again at the chair. I could see the moment when the weight of the situation truly settled into her thoughts. She walked slowly to the children's table and pulled the tiny chair out from beneath it. The legs made the same soft scraping sound across the wooden floor that I had heard earlier when I sat down. Lauren lifted the chair and carried it toward the kitchen as if it were simply another object that needed to be put away after the party. When she returned, her expression had changed slightly, not with embarrassment but with the thoughtful seriousness of someone reconsidering a choice. She said quietly that she had been overwhelmed preparing the party and that sometimes when people feel stressed they make careless decisions without realizing how they will look to someone else. David listened carefully and then said that what mattered most now was recognizing the moment and learning from it rather than pretending it never happened. From upstairs Ethan called again asking if the sky was dark enough yet for the telescope. Lauren smiled faintly at the sound of his voice and answered that he could come down in a minute. The tension in the room softened as the conversation slowly moved away from the earlier misunderstanding. David turned toward me and asked if I would stay a little longer to help Ethan look at the stars like we had promised him earlier. I told him that I would be happy to stay because moments like that were exactly the reason I had come to the party in the first place. Ethan came running down the stairs a moment later wearing a sweater over his shirt and carrying the telescope tripod carefully in both hands as if it were a piece of delicate treasure. The three of us stepped outside into the cool evening air while Lauren followed behind us holding a small flashlight so we could see where to place the telescope on the lawn. The sky had grown darker now and a few bright stars were already visible above the rooftops of the quiet neighborhood. Ethan helped adjust the legs of the tripod while I positioned the telescope toward the moon that hung clearly in the sky. When he looked through the lens, his voice filled with excitement again as he described the bright surface and the shadows of the craters. David watched him with a smile that looked both proud and thoughtful. For a while none of us spoke about the earlier conversation inside the house. Instead, we stood together in the quiet backyard sharing the simple wonder of the night sky, and in that peaceful moment it felt as though the family had found its balance again. The cool evening air settled gently over the backyard as Ethan continued looking through the telescope with the careful focus of someone discovering something new about the world. The neighborhood had grown quiet now that the birthday party was over, and most of the houses along the street showed only soft porch lights and glowing windows. Ethan stepped away from the telescope for a moment and looked up at the sky with wide eyes before asking if there were more stars hiding beyond the ones we could see. I explained that there were thousands more scattered across the sky and that the telescope simply helped bring a few of them closer. He nodded thoughtfully as if trying to imagine a sky filled with more stars than he could count. David stood beside us with his hands in his pockets watching Ethan move the telescope slowly across the horizon. Lauren remained near the patio holding the small flashlight, but she was not using it anymore because the moonlight was bright enough to see the outline of the lawn and the garden path. For a while none of us spoke very much. The quiet rhythm of the evening seemed to invite reflection rather than conversation. Ethan eventually stepped back and asked if I wanted to look through the telescope too. I smiled and told him that seeing the sky through his excitement was already more than enough for me. He laughed softly and returned to the eyepiece while David adjusted the angle of the tripod so the lens would stay steady. After a few minutes, Ethan announced proudly that he could see a bright star near the moon and asked if that meant he was becoming an astronomer. David chuckled and told him that every astronomer starts exactly that way, by simply looking up and asking questions. Lauren walked a little closer to where we were standing and watched Ethan quietly. When she spoke, her voice was gentle and thoughtful. She said that sometimes a simple moment like this reminds people what family gatherings are really supposed to feel like. David nodded slowly and glanced toward me before answering that the best celebrations are the ones where everyone feels like they belong in the same place together. Ethan looked back from the telescope with curiosity because he sensed that the adults were speaking about something important even though he did not know the details. Lauren smiled at him and said that tonight had been a wonderful birthday and that the telescope might become his favorite gift. Ethan agreed immediately and said he wanted to use it again the next weekend if the sky was clear. The idea of future nights spent exploring the stars seemed to brighten his expression even more than the party had earlier in the day. Eventually the cool air began to settle more heavily over the yard and David suggested that it was time to bring the telescope inside before the grass became damp with dew. Ethan carefully folded the tripod while I lifted the telescope tube and together we carried it toward the patio door. As we stepped back into the warm light of the living room, the decorations from the party looked softer and less overwhelming than they had during the afternoon. Lauren gathered a few remaining plates from the table and then paused beside me for a moment. She said quietly that she hoped the next family gathering would feel different and that sometimes people only realize the importance of small choices after seeing their effect. I told her that families grow stronger not by avoiding mistakes but by learning from them with honesty and respect. She nodded in agreement and the tension that had once hovered over the afternoon finally seemed to dissolve completely. Ethan placed the telescope box carefully near the staircase and declared that this had been the best birthday he could remember. As David turned off the last string of decorative lights and the house settled into a calm evening silence, I realized that the real gift of the day had not been the telescope or the cake or the decorations. The real gift had been the quiet understanding that sometimes a single moment can remind a family how important it is to make sure everyone always has a place at the table.